Good evening. My name is Jim Bond. I'm the program director at the Deschutes River Conservancy, and I want to thank all of you for being with us tonight for another one of our Raise the Deschutes seminar series. Before we begin, I just want to a couple little notes. First, I want to make sure because the Deschutes River Conservancy was formed in part by the Confederated Tribes of the Warm Springs Reservation. I want to acknowledge that we share this basin with the Native people who have called this region home for thousands of years. We honor them and join them in stewardship of our rivers for the next 7 generations. In addition, I want to say thank you to the sponsors for tonight's event, Rab Lighting, Roundhouse Foundation, City of Bend, Sun Country Tours, Hand in Hand Productions, and I want to thank Matt and Donovan. These are the guys that help us live stream these events and make available all of our archived videos online for after the fact. And then also a thank you to Worthy Brewing for helping host us here tonight. So I think some of the times for these seminar series, we'll focus and kind of do a deep dive on a particular issue or topic. We were talking as a group and thinking, it would be nice to just kind of take a step back and just give a little bit more of a survey of an overview of kind of where we've been, where we came from and where we're going, all the great work that's happened. So tonight, Raising the Deschutes Challenges and Solutions for Our Rivers is really kind of a primer again for the Deschutes Basin and to familiarize yourselves with all the great work that's been done and where we hope to continue to go. And so we've got most of the Deschutes River Conservancy folks here tonight. We're going to pass the mic a few times, and we're going to have plenty of time for questions and answers as well. So we really want this to be sort of a comfortable conversation around the Deschutes River, and feel free to bring your questions towards the end here. And with that, I want to introduce one of our stars at the DRC, Lisa Seals. She's a program manager. You know her from the face of the Raise the Deschutes seminar series, and she's going to lead us through a lot of the topics tonight. So, thank you.
Thanks, Jim. Thank you all for coming. Thanks so much for everyone for continuing to care and want to learn about our river. I see, or our rivers, I should say plural. I see a lot of familiar faces in the audience, which is fantastic. And I typically like to ask people who have been to seminars before, but tonight I want to ask you all to raise your hand if you have never attended a Raise the Deschutes seminar series before. Okay, all right. So I would say probably about maybe 30% of you haven't ever been. Welcome. This is, as Jim said, a fantastic one for you all to be stepping into because we are taking a little bit of a step back or really a step up, and we're going to kind of look at the work of the Deschutes River Conservancy and all of our partners and all the things that we've been up to for about 30 years and what we've been doing and sort of where we're going. So it's a great one for all of you that are new to the seminar series. And while we do like this to be sort of a conversation and we want to leave a lot of time for questions at the end of the presentation, we also would hope that you would hold your questions, if you can, until the end, with the exception being if we accidentally start rambling using crazy acronyms or terms that we haven't defined for folks, either wave or give me a blank look. I can see this side of the room pretty well, but I can't see that side of the room. So just let me know that we've somehow stumbled into territory where I'm speaking a language that is not understandable, and I'll back up and try to define things better. But I think most of you should have note cards on your chairs, and that's for you to jot down questions that occur to you during the presentation that we'd be more than happy to answer at the end. So,
Let me just add real quick.
yeah.
It's always exciting for these events because it's not just DRC talking at you. There's so many different partners and stakeholders that are working in the basin, and oftentimes those experts are in the crowd as well. So when we get to that Q&A part later on, there may be opportunities for other people to respond to questions that are just kind of sitting there among us, and we really welcome that and thank all of you for bringing your bits of information and your expertise to tonight as well. So thanks in advance.
That's an excellent point, Jim. Yeah, I'm looking out in addition to having the newbies in the audience and having people that have attended, we have a tremendous amount of knowledge in this room right now with a lot of the actual partners that are working on these projects with us are sitting in the room tonight. So yeah, we may be asking those folks to stand up and giving them a microphone at some point in this process as well. So typically, when we do these presentations, I feel like I do a little bit of talking, but tonight I think I'm going to do a little bit more talking. So hopefully that's okay with everybody. But I've got Jim, and then also some of our coworkers are going to talk about specific tools.
And I want to also acknowledge that Kate Fitzpatrick, who many of you know, is our executive director at the DRC. She is out sick tonight, which is part of the reason you get to see my smiling face up here. I'm not even close in comparison to what Kate can usually do for these, but I'm going to give it my best shot. And I've got Lisa and all the crew here for a lot of great support. So with that, we're
All
going to
right,
get going.
let's make it happen. So we're going to start out with just a pretty broad overview. You're looking at the state of Oregon here, and we've got the Deschutes Basin highlighted. The Deschutes Basin is about 10,000 square miles in size. The headwaters actually run from south to north. So again, that never ceases to break my brain. I always think it should go in the other direction, but it actually runs from the south and goes north to meet the Columbia River near the Dowels. So trivia that I like to start with is the Deschutes is the second largest river basin in the state of Oregon. Who knows what the first one is? And I want to say the people that I know. Guesses, anyone? I think I heard the Umpqua. Just shout it out for this one. The Willamette, yes, correct. Our neighbor directly to the west, the Willamette, is the largest basin in the state, and the Deschutes comes in second. So fantastic. I wish I had in my classes when I used to teach, I used to like to throw Hershey kisses, but I don't have any tonight. So, okay, so the Willamette is the largest, the Deschutes is the second largest. So talking about moving from south to north, the headwaters, this is another good question. And if you, nope, you can't see, it's not labeled on there. Who knows what the headwaters of the Deschutes River is? Little Lava Lake. Yes, 10 points. I love it. Yes. So, although it can be said, and I like to refer to the Cascade Range as the headwaters, that is the true headwaters, right? Where all the precipitation is falling and making its way into the groundwater before it's discharged into the rivers and lakes. Technically speaking, the first continuous surface water of the Deschutes starts at Little Lava Lake. So if you haven't had a chance to go visit, I highly recommend checking that out in the summer months. And again, we flow from south to north. Another thing, I know Jim mentioned this in his introduction, but we also want to acknowledge that almost the entirety of the Deschutes Basin falls within the ceded lands of the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs. So on this map, you can see the state of Oregon, and then you can see that white area is the ceded lands, and that overlaid blue area is the Deschutes Basin. So with the exception of the very upper pieces of the Deschutes Basin, the whole entirety of the basin um, falls within the ceded lands. The ceded lands being the lands that the tribes gave up in and that little brown or brick red area on the map is the reservation at this point. But I will note that the tribes do retain some rights to hunt and fish within their traditional lands. So that's an important note. But yeah, so just wanted to acknowledge that. All right, getting to this one. This one's my favorite one. If you've heard me talk before, you've seen this map before. So this map is the state of Oregon, and all of the lines on the map are all of the surface water in the state, right? So when you're looking at Central Oregon, and particularly the Deschutes Basin, what do you notice? It is very, very dry, yes. So not a lot of surface water. So not only do we not have a lot of precipitation that falls within our basin, well, I should say most of the precipitation in our basin falls in the Cascade Range. And then as you go east, those precipitation values drop tremendously. And I think where we're sitting today is like on average, we see less than 10 inches of rain a year. But the rain that we do receive and the snow that we do receive, the reason why you don't see lines on this map is because that water basically just percolates directly into the groundwater. And that's because we live in a highly volcanic area, and by geologic standards, a very recently geologically active area. So most of the geology in this area is extremely porous basalt. So all that water falls on the ground and immediately makes its way into the groundwater, as opposed to what you might think of when you're thinking of, rivers on the west side. I don't know how many people have spent time in Portland or Eugene or Corvallis. If it rains over there and you wait a little while and you look at a river, that river is swollen and is running chocolate brown, right? Because what happens is all that water that falls on the ground in areas that are not as porous and volcanic is that runs off the landscape and makes its way into rivers. But here in the Deschutes Basin, instead of the surface water carrying water into the Deschutes, you have a system where all that water gets absorbed like a sponge. And then what that means is that we have a very different hydrogeology and a very different hydrology, where the river, get to another slide here. Actually, I'll come back to that in just a second. I want to go to this one. This is called a hydrograph. So what this is it's a graph that shows river flow over time. And it starts in October, which is the beginning technically of a water year, and goes through September. And what you'll notice is this is representing the upper Deschutes River, just below Wikiup. And because of all that very porous volcanic geology and not a lot of surface water running into the rivers, most of the flow from the Deschutes River and a lot of the rivers and streams in the upper Deschutes is groundwater fed. And so that means that the ground is literally feeding the rivers, and they feed the rivers at a relatively stable rate. No matter how hard it's snowing or raining, the river really historically had a very stable flow, like one of the most stable flowing rivers in the country, if not the world. So this is a really important point, because when we start talking about rivers, specifically the Deschutes, this one acts so much differently than every other river system that most people are accustomed to. So I'm just going to go back a quick second to this one final map. I think it's my one final map. So again, this is the Deschutes Basin. You got light green on top and the dark green on the bottom. I just wanted to note the dark green area, which is the area above Lake Billy Chinook, is oftentimes referred to as the upper Deschutes. So I just wanted to make that distinction for everyone. And when we talk about that specific hydrogeology and the groundwater fed systems and the stability of the river, we're talking about that stretch of river that is above the Pelton Round Butte facility, which is where those three rivers come together there at Lake Billy Chinook. So, okay. So moving along. All right, so now hopefully you have a high level understanding of the fact that we've got, historically speaking, a very stable river in the upper Deschutes Basin. And then you also have historically about, 150 years ago, this area started to be resettled by non-tribal folks. And everybody, started moving out west, and they were drawn here by the perceived limitless resources that were out here. And you've got tons and tons of land that could be farmed, tons of water that could be put to use in rivers, tons of forests that could be felled to build homes. And that is literally what sort of drew populations to the West Coast, right? And the Deschutes is no exception. So back in the late 1800s, there were advertising, come to Central Oregon, put the water to use, and in return, the land can be yours, right? So folks flocked here literally to take advantage of the fact that there were these bountiful rivers, and obviously that has had impacts. This is a picture of downtown Bend, I believe in 1910. And if you zoom in on the picture, actually the Central Oregon Realty Company there in the bottom left-hand side of the picture is advertising, timberland and irrigated land, trying to encourage development in this area, right? So I think it's really important for us all to remember that that is effectively um, that was the driver for much of what we see today, as folks came here like really trying to make lives for themselves and trying to like use the resources to make a livelihood and to make the land productive.
And I'd add too, it was not just the driver, but the promise, right? So on the sign, irrigated land, like this is a place where you can come and you can make the land productive and there will be water and that sort of thing. So it really drove a lot of people out to the West. And then the result of that over time is like, oh, wait a minute, maybe the resources aren't quite as extensive as we thought. And so that's kind of set the stage for some of the challenges and the issues that we're dealing with right now.
Yeah. Yes, thank you. I think, I think it could be argued that we're still wrapping our brains around the idea that we don't have limitless resources, right? So it's a whole another discussion. But coming back to the slideshow here. This is an important map for us to all show. So this map again is the Upper Deschutes Basin. So, well, with the exception, you can see Lake Billy Chinook is kind of up in the upper part here. I do have a pointer, I think. I always struggle with this thing. Do I have a pointer, Matt?
There you go. Keep going to your right.
This is always the fun part.
Look at the monitor. There you go.
Oh, okay.
There you go.
Yay! Okay, so weird, Jim. I'm getting in your space. Okay, so up here is Lake Billy Chinook, right? But essentially, this map represents the Upper Deschutes Basin, and all of the different colors on the map represent different irrigation districts in our area. There are 8 of them. Not all 8 of them are listed on this map, but what I want to point out is part of that promise of development was, come here, use the water in the rivers, make the land productive, and when you do that, they gave out water rights associated with that use. So if you were using the water, you got a water right, and water rights have dates associated with their certification or their certificate. So you can see the dates are listed here of the different irrigation districts in our area that settled in different times when they put the water to use on the landscape, right? And so around Bend, that dark green color, just south of Bend, is Arnold Irrigation District, for instance, and Arnold has a 1905 priority date. The light green area that is in Bend and going up towards Redmond, that's Central Oregon Irrigation District, and they have a couple of water rights, one that dates 1900 and another 1907. And by the time we got to that, pinkish region up in North Unit, that date was 1913. And I just want to point out, I'm going to talk about this a little bit more in one of the next slides, but by the time those folks got to putting water on the landscape, there was no more water in the river to be given. So we had already over appropriated. We'd already given out more water rights at that time than existed in the river. And so in order to serve those lands up there, up north, we needed to use storage. We needed to have reservoirs to capture water in the winter and put that water to use in the summer.
And I just want to add to that too. So if you think about year to year, the amount of water that might be available changes every single year too. So the priority dates are extremely important. If you're lower priority, if you're more junior and with a water right, so like North Unit Irrigation District is 1913, there may be some years where there's enough water that they get their rights filled, but there may be other years where they would be one of the first cut. there's just not enough water. So again, the priority system here is first in time, first in right. So if you have a 1905 or an 1899 water right, you're golden, because you know that you are literally first in line. As that water comes down the system, you got first dibs on it. The more junior you are in our water right system, the more at risk the water availability is for you to be able to produce or do whatever you need with the water.
Right. Yes, thank you for that. And we honestly could do we have done an entire Raise the Deschutes on water rights and water law. And I would actually encourage you all, if you, in your spare time, get your popcorn and look us up on YouTube and on our website to go into a deeper dive in water rights. But yeah, the important point is there is a pecking order. That pecking order is prior appropriation doctrine. So the oldest water rights get served before the more recent water rights, which we call the junior water rights. But the other important piece of this puzzle is that essentially, we did such a good job back in the early 1900s making the land productive and giving out water rights that can you guess who got left out of the system? Or what got left out of the system? The river, exactly. So it never really occurred to anyone back in 1905 or 1913 that there was really any value to leaving water in the river. In fact, just the concept was let's use all the resources. Like that's what they're here for. Let's green the desert. Let's grow food. Let's make the land productive. And no, the river had no rights at that time. So basically, they gave away all the live flow that existed in the river, and then they built reservoirs to hold back more water and serve more lands. Again, with no concept of the idea that in the future we might actually want to have water in rivers, and there might be some value to doing that. So before, about 30 years ago, before any of this work began with the partners and with the Deschutes River Conservancy's formation, 98% of the flows in the Deschutes River were diverted for irrigation. So, and the diversions, for those of you that don't know, most of the diversions in Bend happen just off of Division Avenue, right upriver from the River House and Sawyer Park. So if you go to the old mill in the summertime, the river looks full, and it is, right? But right below there is where most of those diversions occur. So historically, 98% of those flows were diverted. And then you've got Wychoose Creek that runs through the town of Sisters. Again, historically, 2 out of every 3 years, that creek would run completely dry. And then the Crooked River, the lower section of the Crooked River running through Smith Rock State Park, also extensively diverted and mostly dry in the summer months. So that was the history that sort of brought us all to where we all began, really coming together and forming partnerships and forming just trying to solve these problems. So real quick, I think this is going back to water rights distributions. This is what the water rights distribution, surface water rights distributions look like today in the Deschutes Basin. So we've got 86% of the water in the Deschutes Basin upper Deschutes Basin is being diverted for agriculture. 2% for municipal uses and 12% for in-stream. And I will say that before the DRC and all of the partners, a lot of whom are in the room, before we all started working together, that 12%, that wasn't the reality. That 12% is part of the work that we've done the last 30 years to secure water rights for the rivers. So, okay, going back real quick to talk a little bit more about flow issues and specifically different stretches of river that we're working on restoring. I already mentioned that most of the river, the Deschutes, the main stem Deschutes, gets diverted from Bend, just Division Avenue. So that's sometimes we refer to that stretch from Bend down to Lake Billy Chinook as the middle Deschutes. So the middle Deschutes gets extensively diverted in the summer months. So when it's time to start growing crops, that's when that water is needed and when the flows get really low. The other stretch of river that I want to point out, and we've already talked a little bit about this, but is the stretch of river below Wickiup. See if I can do this. I may have been. Oh no, it works. so here's Wickiup Reservoir, and this stretch that's being highlighted right now is what we refer to as the Upper Deschutes. And I already talked about this, but the lands up here are being irrigated exclusively, or historically have been irrigated exclusively with stored water from this reservoir all the way down here, right? So what that means is that in October, when the irrigation season is over, historically, they closed the dam and they held back almost all of what used to be 600 or 700 cubic feet per second, which is a lot of water. They hold back almost all of that to store water for use in the summer months, right? So, so those flows, again, going back 5 years, 10 years ago, used to be down to about 20 CFS from a natural flow of 700 in the winter to 20 CFS. And then in the summer months, spring, April-ish, we start to divert water from Wickiup Reservoir into the the upper Deschutes, and flows would get as high as 1,500, 1,600, 1,800, 2,000 CFS to move all that water from Wickiup Reservoir down the upper Deschutes to be diverted at Bend, right? So that fluctuation, taking that very stable, taking that very stable hydrograph that I showed you, that blue line where flows used to naturally occurring were really stable. We ended up with a hydrograph that looks a lot like the green one. So really low flows in the upper Deschutes in the winter months, and then really high flows in the summer months. It's actually opposite what you would think if you start thinking about a normal river where that's reacting to runoff, right? Where you have high flows in the winter and low flows in the summer. It's kind of a flip-flop here, but and then
I just want to add too, what
Yeah.
you could imagine what that might then do to the habitat and just the channel shape and everything, right? So you've got these way bigger than normal flows that are moving through the system and that are cutting the side banks out and sort of channelizing the stream. Any of that habitat, any of that spawning gravel, all that kind of stuff gets blown out, moved downstream, and it's just this flip-flop cycle year after year. So the Deschutes Basin and the upper Deschutes used to be really known for this amazing red band trout fishery, and it's not what it was, for sure. I mean, there's a lot of recovery work that's happening, but that management of water in the basin and the changes in the hydrograph have really affected a lot of the biology and the ecology of the systems as well. And so that's part of the flow restoration that we're working on, but also the habitat restoration. All the different partners, agencies, and folks, we're trying to find solutions to not just bring the flow back, but really restore the whole system.
Yep. So that was great. You let me flip through some of these photos, and you got to describe what was what we were looking at. That was perfect. It was almost like we planned this. So one more thing, just to drive home the point about flows. So
Maybe we should just have a conversation, you know, just like this.
as if we don't have this conversation every day. Okay, one more graph chart picture I want to show you. So this is a schematic that we put together of from the upper Deschutes to Lake Billy Chinook. So what we call the upper and middle Deschutes in the winter months and the summer months, and kind of historically how things have been managed since we started storing and diverting water 100 plus years ago. So the winter months, we've already talked about this, so I'm retreading on this ground, but really driving the point home. So in the winter months, we store water for irrigation, holding back water in Wickiup Reservoir, therefore having profound impacts on that stretch of river right below Wickiup that gets dewatered in the winter. And then in the summer months, we are letting all that water go so it can serve irrigation needs, and then that water gets diverted at Bend right around Division Avenue, and so you have really low flows in the middle Deschutes rivers. So those are some of the flow issues that we are working on with all of the partners that we're working on solving. there's been a lot of emphasis on the upper Deschutes in recent years, and so that's kind of why I've spent a little bit more time talking about that.
And again, that flip in the hydrograph, right? So we just talked about the upper Deschutes and the impacts that that has for the fisheries and the habitat. But the same thing is happening in the middle Deschutes when you basically turn off the water and move it back out, into um, to the farmers and the ranchers across the basin. So now you have fish that were moving around and aquatic life that were using that, and all of a sudden, hundreds of CFS drop, right? In some cases, there was no water. So really, really kind of shocks to the system year after year, whether you're in the upper or the lower. It just was seasonal.
Yep. So, and it's not just the river though that has been suffering in recent years. I really want to make clear that these issues are compounded by several things. I mean, one of which is drought. We have been experiencing unprecedented drought in recent years that has definitely made it harder for us to use our limited water resources to meet all the needs in the basin. Because of that system of prior appropriation, and the fact that the folks in that purple blob up near Madras and Lake Billy Chinook are dependent. They're the junior irrigators in the system, meaning they're the last in line. They have been dealing with extreme shortages. In recent years. Their water rights have been cut from, usually they get about 2 acre feet per season, and in not that a couple years ago, I think they got like 0.5 acre feet. So, I mean, can you imagine trying to grow a crop for production agriculture with 6 inches of water in a desert? Like it doesn't really pencil. So there's been extreme water insecurity for those folks, and then drought. And then, of course, we've got one of the fastest growing regions in the United States. It's an incredibly popular place to live. I'm curious, how many people have moved here in the last 5 years? Right. Okay. You guys are helping me make my point. Yeah. So about, I would say, half the audience has moved here. And again, I mean, I always like to say there really are no villains in this story. We just have a changing landscape and changing priorities and changing realities. Again, like I think most of us in this room can probably acknowledge that we aren't dealing with limitless resources. Like we now we have an ecosystem and there are limits, and it's time for us to kind of try to rebalance the scales, right? So in addition, we've been talking a lot about water quantity, and the Deschutes River Conservancy, our goal is to restore stream flow and improve water quality. So we haven't forgotten also that there are water quality issues in our basin as well. A lot of the water quality issues stem from temperature, which is directly related to flow, right? If you have more flow, you can have a cooler river, and that makes for a healthier river. But we also have nutrient issues in certain areas. And what else am I forgetting? I feel like this is more your area than my area, but
I would say that from a water quality standpoint, yeah, the two primary focus for us and for anyone in the basin really is the temperature issues and the nutrient and nitrate issues. Those nutrient issues, generally the Crooked River watershed, and then sort of into Lake Billy Chinook, and then below the dam complex. So the lower Deschutes tend to be the places where we're seeing a lot of those impacts. And then the temperature issues can be in any of the flow limited streams.
I'm going to borrow this for a second. And then lastly, in terms of issues, this has been in the news a lot lately. I want my pink one back.
Pink and blue, so we know which one to have.
Okay, thank you. So this has also been in the news a lot lately. The state just issued some new groundwater rules, and the idea that there isn't just limitless amounts of groundwater is also something that the state in general is grappling with. And we do have declining groundwater levels in certain areas in our basin, so that is another issue that we are grappling with. So Before I'm going to get to let Jim talk more here in a minute. But last thing I want to talk about is, a few years ago we had we wrapped up a major study that we had been working on for, I don't know, 5 or 10 years, called the Basin Study. And essentially that Basin Study looked at water supply and demand in light of a changing climate or hydrologic variability or whatever you want to call it. And we essentially came to note that the vast majority of the demands in the basin really fall in the bucket of rivers and streams, with the caveat that those junior irrigation districts also are very water insecure. So 20% of those shortfalls also are for the junior irrigators in the agricultural realm. And then municipalities also are trying to secure water for growth. And the reason, I just want to explain really quickly, the reason why you have the cross-hatching on this particular pie chart, I'm not going to go into detail about this, but in order for the municipalities to access new groundwater, they have to restore surface water flows because there's an acknowledgement that groundwater and surface water are connected. So to pump more from the ground, you have to restore more flows in our basin. And so that is why 80%, you got the cross hatching there, that in order for those municipalities to access groundwater, there has to be some stream restoration. So that is laying the groundwork for the problems. And hopefully we haven't thoroughly depressed you yet, because we haven't gotten to the really exciting part about all the great work that we've done and that we're going to continue to do, where we all get a little bit uplifted, hopefully. So with that, I'm going to turn it pass it off to Jim to talk about the Deschutes River Conservancy and our partnerships and some of our history.
Thank you, Lisa. So Lisa is so good at all of this, but we do need to give her a little bit of a break. So I'm going to try to take a few slides. I'm still going to lean on you a little bit. You're going to jump in and help me out on a few too. But yeah, I just wanted to kind of give you a little bit of an overview or background of the Deschutes River Conservancy, very, very, very high level, and then just talk about some of the successes that we've seen in the basin, both at the DRC, but when I say we, I mean we, all the different partners and stakeholders that are working in this basin. So just a little background first. The Deschutes River Conservancy, we mentioned, was formed in 1996. It was really this great idea of a variety of different people. So we've got the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs, we've got the irrigation districts, we've got environmental interests coming together to form the DRC because they recognized a few things. One, that water challenges are very difficult to solve, and even more so difficult to solve if you're just standing in your own corner. And so the foundation, the vision for the DRC is to try to tackle these water problems that we're dealing with in this basin in a collaborative way. So bringing all the different stakeholders together, coming together to understand each other's perspectives on these things, and then work together to build solutions. The mission for the DRC is to restore stream flow and water quality in the Deschutes Basin, but it is completely underlined by this idea of collaboration and consensus. So DRC, I think we have a 15-member board right now, or if they're all filled, 15 when it's all filled, but they represent all a variety of different sectors, from agencies to the irrigation districts to private interests, to the ranchers and farmers. Who am I missing?
Yeah,
Lots of
federal agencies, yes.
state and federal
A lot of
agencies.
different people at the table.
And so in that forum, the same thing is that the board is and with the staff are coming together to identify consensus-based solutions and move forward in that way.
Yeah, just a tiny little history lesson too. I know a lot of you weren't around in Oregon or in the Pacific Northwest in the 90s, but the backdrop of what was happening in that era was the spotted owl had been listed as an endangered species, and there was incredible conflict going on in the timber industry. And mills were shutting their doors across the state, and people were losing their jobs, and it was very much like save a log or eat an owl bumper stickers and things that I literally grew up with and seeing. And so after watching and seeing what can happen when people are at odds and not working together, I mean, it really had profound impacts on the whole economy in Oregon. And so looking forward, I think there was definitely this acknowledgement, not just at the DRC and not just with the stakeholders who form the DRC, but across the state of like, hey, we need a different approach. Like we need to all work together to make sure that we don't follow in the same footsteps with that. So that's sort of the history that brought us to the formation.
And I want to
Awesome.
mention too, so I named the different stakeholders, and the part of the founding members were the tribes, but I also want to just sort of highlight the fact that Bobby Bruno from the tribes, from the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs, he's actually our board chairman as well. So their voice is very present on our board as well. So now I just kind of want to talk about what have we done. And again, a lot of this is DRC, the work that we're involved in, but it's by no means only the results of this work is by no means only the DRC. So
Every time we say we, not just DRC, but all the partners, because not a single thing has been done with just one entity. It's irrigation districts, it's all the state and federal agencies, it's the tribes, it's the other nonprofit organizations and environmental entities. I'm missing people, but it's the collective we.
so we'll just take a little tour, and as Lisa sort of set up the stage for this a little bit ago when we talked about White's Creek going dry 2 out of every 3 years, and was it the Deschutes 98% was diverted out of the system. So not that long ago, White's Creek would be dry in the summertime. And now, because of a lot of the work that we have been doing and our partners have been doing, we will see at a minimum 20 CFS, 20 to 45 CFS flowing through the town of Sisters. So White's Creek, for those of you that don't know, is a tributary to the Deschutes that drains into the middle Deschutes. It flows on the west side of the river, coming out of the mountains through the town of Sisters, and then down into the Deschutes.
Yeah, so if you go and stand on White's Creek in Sisters in the summer months, like in August, and every drop of water in that river can be attributed to the work of the partnership with the irrigation districts and other entities to put that water back in stream.
And so, 20 to 45 CFS, that's a lot of water. And if you're at the park in Sisters, you can see it looks like a very healthy, functioning stream system. We work on the flow component, but we've got partners that we work closely with that are working on the habitat and the land aspects as well. And so I just wanted, as part of the story of success in White's Creek, we have to acknowledge Three Sisters Irrigation District and all the work that they've been doing with piping their system and working with us to lease water, but then also the Deschutes Land Trust and the Upper Deschutes Watershed Council and all the great work that they're doing. So this slide here just represents a particular reach below Sisters on White's Creek. And you can see it in July 2015. It was basically sort of a dry meadow, kind of just a wetland that didn't really have any stream complexity or, frankly, much water there.
Well, White's, I believe you can't even see it in that picture in 2015. It was straightened, entirely straightened, and so it was essentially a ditch that just ran, I think, on the edge of this piece of property. So it's not even it was not connected to the meadow, like hydrologically speaking. It was no longer a wetland. So so you can't even see the stream in the 2015. There also not as much water, of course. Flow restoration occurred, and then restoration on the landscape occurred, and that's what you see in 2016 is in progress flow restoration.
And so an organization like the Deschutes Land Trust is able to go out and acquire the land that needs the restorative work. And then an organization like the Upper Deschutes Watershed Council, working with other partners, can actually bring that change to bear on the stream, reactivate the floodplain, put kind of diversity of channel
Breeding.
features braiding, whatever you want to call it, but channel features that really help support the biological life and the fish in these systems. And you can see what a tremendous change has happened in this particular reach between 2015 and 2019, at least in these photos.
Yeah. Here's
It's
another
amazing.
in process photo of probably around that, when was that, 2017, where they're putting woody debris back, because that's another thing that was done. And when going back to the historical piece of it, when folks arrived, they didn't really see great value in having debris in streams. It was really an impediment, or having a braided system with different oxbows and things. It was like, especially if you're trying to run a log down that to get it to the mill, right? It's way better if it's just a straight shot. And so there was a lot of ditching that happened of a lot of natural waterways, removing of woody debris, essentially separating that waterway from its historic floodplain, not understanding the value of wetlands, right? We just, I think historically, again, just would see swampy areas and think of them as kind of wastelands. What's that doing? Fast forward to what we know now we realize how incredibly important all those braided channels are for habitat, and how incredibly important woody debris is for habitat, and how incredibly important wetlands are for water quality and for water storage and other things. So, but again, these are the things that we didn't quite know in 1900 when we arrived and we were trying to get a log from the forest to the mill, right? So I digress, sorry.
No, that was great. So we talked about the middle Deschutes again, remembering that basically we're talking about the reach of the Deschutes River from Bend near the what was the hotel?
Yeah,
I'm
the
currently
river
going
house,
to
the
bed.
river house, the river house,
River
Sawyer
House.
Park. So just below Division Avenue. So you can go to that park on Portland Avenue, and see, or the old mill, and you can see the river full. And then if you travel on down to Sawyer Park, or go have a drink at the River House, and sit on their beautiful patio. I don't work for the River House, by the way, but but they do. It is a great river view. You can see where all the difference between the flows in the summer months. So especially like in July and August.
Yeah, and so not that long ago, when the irrigation season started and they would divert, you had basically 0 to maybe 30 CFS, depending on the year, that would flow in that lower section, which is pretty tremendous. Again, thinking about the size of the Deschutes River, and sort of as a frame of reference, when you're at the old mill, like that's the general shape and size and flow, and then you can go downstream from that, and in a short order, a few miles, you'd be down to almost nothing. But now, because of the work that we've been doing and our partners have been doing and the irrigation districts have been doing, tons of work to help improve their systems and their conveyance networks, and we've got leasing programs, we now see in the summertime 140 CFS back in that middle Deschutes stretch. And it's amazing. It's beautiful, right? It flows through Sawyer Park. I hang out there a fair amount, and I see people fishing all the time and recreating and just really enjoying that reach. It's amazing.
We're not done yet. We're hoping to go to 250 though, just in case you're. We're still working on it, because it's not where we would like it to be, but it's come a long way.
Yeah, and that I was gonna cap things off a little bit later with just that statement, but I think we can probably highlight that a few times. Just because I'm super happy about the 140 CFS doesn't mean that we're resting on our laurels. There's a ton of work to do.
We're
Um,
still hard at work.
Yeah. So, in addition, just another example, Crooked River. So again, we're talking about irrigation districts that, and they've got every legal right to do this. And there's producers out there that need this water too. So they've been taking the water out of the stream and putting it out onto the lands, but it's left virtually no flows in some of these systems. And so through creative agreements that we've been able to work with the irrigation districts, with other federal agencies like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, we've been able to, and leasing programs that we've worked on, which we get a little taste of in a bit, we've been able to make sure that there's at least roughly 70 CFS in the Crooked River. And again, this is that reach that basically starts just upstream of Smith Rock State Park, and then would go to basically Opal Springs. And Opal Springs is this pretty amazing natural phenomenon where the water just blows through the canyon walls and brings flows back to the river. But between that and Smith Rock, it would be pretty much dry if it wasn't for all the great work that we and all of our partners have been doing. I forget exactly how many examples. This might be the
This is the last one. You're good.
So the last one is Tumalo Creek, just another tributary, really important tributary to the Middle Deschutes as well, in part because of the cold water that it provides to help mitigate some of those temperature challenges that we were talking about before. So again, we have a system that is diverted for irrigation. In this case, Tumalo Irrigation District has done a ton of work on their own accord and helping pipe their system and bring some flows back. And then we've got leasing programs that we help them with as well. And so now where it once was, again, virtually no flow, in the summertime, you can expect to see 20 to 28 CFS. And that's the flows that you would see in Shevlin Park, through Shevlin?
I believe so. Yeah. No. Yes.
No? Yes? Yes. Okay, thank you. Confirmation. Appreciate that.
All right. And last but not least,
Yeah.
progress as a whole across the basin.
And this basically just shows, kind of where we've been going over the years as far as how much flow has been restored. And not all of this is all at the same time, but it's
Right.
cumulative. So we've gone from like kind of where we began in 2002 to just over 50 CFS, maybe 60 CFS. And now we've seen over 350 CFS restored to the system. Again, that's not 350 CFS at all the time. It's seasonal, different times of
Yeah,
year.
it's across all those different reaches that we just talked about. So cumulative impact of all the partnerships, all the collaborations, and all the work of the DRC is restored 350 approximately CFS to different stretches of river at different times of the year. One way in which I really think this is a useful graph, because we're about to talk about like how do we do this, and we're going to just give you, I know we don't have a ton of time and we want to take questions, but we're going to give you a high level overview of some of the tools that we use to restore flows. But before we do, I like to show this graph, or like let everybody take note of the different colors in this graph. It's not super important what they represent. We'll talk about that, but really that it's each color represents a different tool. So we're basically using a variety of different tools to restore flows. And so it's not one single thing that we can do to restore flows. It's not all in-stream leasing or all irrigation modernization. It's really like doing a suite of different projects with all of our different partners all together that has cumulatively given us about 350 CFS restored to the rivers and flows. And that's that 12% of the pie chart that I showed you all in the beginning. That's the in-stream component. That's all of this work. I think that pie chart would have looked way different in 1980.
I also want to acknowledge that I just recognized that in 2024, this chart doesn't show 350. 350 is at the top of the bar graph. But we are above 350. It's just that's not reflected in this particular graph. I'm just calling that out now so we don't get questions later. The only other thing that I want to say about that is, sometimes when we're talking about volumes of water, it can be sort of hard to wrap your head around, like, okay, 350 CFS, what does that exactly mean? So just as a point of reference, we checked some USGS data gauges earlier today. So next time you guys go to Old Mill, if you've been there recently, kind of the Old Mill district, when you look at the Deschutes River right now there, it's about 450 CFS. So that tells you generally, like that gives you just a point of reference for that amount of volume when we say 350 CFS, 450 CFS, whatever it is. So it would be just a little bit less than that, which is a lot of water, in my opinion.
Yep. Okay, so now quickly, I know we're sort of running out of time, but we want to talk about how we do this work with our partners, and again, somewhat at a high level. I feel like I just stole your.
No, it's good. We've got till 8, so we've got time, and we're all here having a good time. And
see, we've been told
people
we have
having
20
beers.
minutes.
Get a beer.
They're telling us. We want to leave time for questions, but okay, so I'm going to kick us off with talking about a tool that is near and dear to my heart because it's a program that I've been helping to run at the Deschutes River Conservancy since I started, and that is our irrigation modernization program, right? You all have seen that agriculture represents now 86% of the water usage in our basin. And so we are doing our absolute best today to work hand in hand with our irrigation district partners to help bring them from their 1900 infrastructure that was put in place way back when, which is hand dug canals through porous basalt geology. And bringing them into the 21st century with much nicer systems that use a whole lot less water and in some cases generate electricity and allow the end users to have pressurized water. And pressurized water, if you're not familiar, is what comes out of your tap at your house. It's what allows you to use a sprinkler in your backyard rather than having to flood irrigate your backyard. So we're working hand in hand with all of our irrigation district partners to take a lot of those old canals that are just ditches that lose on average about 50% of the water in transmission. So that means that we are diverting twice as much water from the rivers as what the end users are getting to use on their farms, right? So putting pipes in the ground to carry that water saves enormous amounts of water in seepage and some water in evaporation. And then because we have a steep topography in this basin, in many cases, not all, but in many cases, there's energy that's generated as that water is moving in those pipes. And so that results in pressurized water, meaning that the end user then doesn't have to have a pump on a pond to use a sprinkler. Instead, they can just hook up like you all do in your backyards. And then in other cases, there's actually hydropower possibilities to be generated from these canals. So we're working on those projects, and that's saving a lot of water. They are not cheap, I will say, especially, in 2025, post-inflation and who knows what with tariffs and other things, these projects are very expensive, but they are very effective at saving water immediately. And so we're going full steam ahead and capturing as many federal and state dollars as we can and other funding sources to try to bring those systems into the 21st century.
And I just want to highlight one other thing about that because I personally find it amazing, right? So you mentioned that about 50% water loss through these canals. And I just want to remind everybody that all of the water that's diverted is really only diverted from a couple locations in Bend. So what that also means, if you remember the map, of how much irrigated land is across the landscape and to the north. So we're talking about a lot of water coming out of the river, moving through ditches that are 30, 40, 50, 60 miles long. So that's a lot of water that is needed to be diverted just to get to the end user on the farm, and
Yeah.
a lot of water that seeps through the canals and never makes it.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. So going back to that map with all the different colored, areas on it, the folks that are irrigating up in the Madras area, Madras and Culver area, their water is diverted from the river in Bend and then is being moving through these hand dug canals up to that area. And the reason that is because if any of you have been up that way, there's a huge river canyon in that area. So when they were irrigating in 1913, there was no way for them to even think about pumping from the river in Madras or in Culver. So they had to divert the water in Bend and have it travel via gravity. These are all gravity-fed canals, and it takes that many miles. So Jim's point is well made that we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of miles of canals across the basin dug in porous volcanic geology. So irrigation modernization. The other part that we're also working not just with irrigation districts, but we're also working hand in hand with private landowners. A lot of folks in this basin are still flood irrigating. So they literally have a ditch that brings water to their property, and then they use a series of ditches on their property and tarps and other things that date back to 1900 to try to spread the water across their landscape and grow a crop. And as you can imagine, it's not very efficient and it's somewhat antiquated. And they might also get all of their water in one big slug once a week to try to try to put to use on their property. So we're working hand in hand with landowners to help folks upgrade their systems to sprinkler systems, which are far more efficient and allow them to deliver the amount of water that the crops need when they need it. So, all right, now I get to stop talking again for a minute. I'm going to invite our coworker, Jacob Kimmick, up to the stage here. He is going to talk about another suite of tools in our toolbox, which is what we call market-based transactions. This is where it gets wonky, folks. So start writing down your questions.
So wonky. The free market, y'all. Here to save us all. My name is Jacob Kimmick. I'm a program manager here at the DRC. Been here for about 4 years. Figured should I give that preface real quick. And I'm going to talk about a few different market-based transactions. And I will apologize because 2 of them, I actually don't really manage the DRC, but I'm lucky enough to be holding the mic right now to talk about them. So we're going to talk about 3 things: in-stream leasing, permanent acquisitions, and water banking. So in-stream leasing, we briefly talked about water rights at the beginning of this conversation. One thing that we didn't note is that in Oregon, most states have a similar requirement, but in Oregon, at least once every 5 years, you have to put your water to beneficial use. Now, luckily in Oregon, in-stream leasing is a beneficial use. So a lot of irrigators out there, if they're not using the water, once every 5 years, they might in-stream lease their water to gain beneficial use benefits. And also irrigation districts at times might require their patrons to in-stream lease their water to maintain those benefits, to maintain the water right for the district as a whole. In-stream leasing luckily maintains about, it varies year to year based on the water year and the needs from each district. But we can get, about 70 CFS out of the cubic feet per second out of the in-stream leasing program. And I will gladly invite my colleagues in the audience to loudly correct me if that is incorrect. But that is just one tool in our toolbox of solutions here that are market-based. The other one is permanent acquisitions. And there's a variety of ways we can get permanent water transactions. And these permanent transactions truly are that permanent. They can be from one user to another, from one diversion to another. But a lot of our goal is in-stream permanent transactions. And that might come from things like, we're here in Bend, urbanizing acres, acres that might be in an irrigation district that are being taken out of use for purpose of land development, properties, things like that. They could also come through things like irrigation modernization that we just talked about, conservation projects. It might conserve a certain amount of CFS that, the state actually just went through a whole process to make a pathway for these things for permanent transactions in stream out of conservation projects. So between those 2 things, just this last summer, for example, Jim already mentioned, we peaked out at about 140 CFS at peak irrigation season. And that is entirely, or at least largely, because of in-stream and permanent transactions, not just in the DRC, but with partners at all of our irrigation districts, across the board in the basin. So those are fantastic tools that we've been doing for a long time that we plan on continuing to do, and we want to grow as much as possible. That said, water banking, the big next thing. Water banking occurs a lot in the Western United States, but it hasn't really taken off here in Oregon. It's something that the DRC just in the last few years has started to approach, and with our partners trying to grow. It's been a slow process, but ultimately it is a major tool that we think is it's not, the only tool, of course, is all these other irrigation modernizations, conservation, all that work. But water banking has the opportunity to provide a lot of water in places where it's needed to go. At the beginning of this presentation, we looked at the irrigation districts, all the priority dates. You'll notice that North Union Irrigation District had a priority date of 1913. Water is a scarce resource in a desert, believe it or not. And we need to get water where it needs to go, not just in wet years, but also, more importantly, in drought years. So the goal of water banking is to use primarily informal transactions. And when I mean informal transactions, that's going, I was about to say going around Oregon Water Resources Department. That makes it sound shady.
You just did say it.
I'll say it again. We're going to go around Oregon Water Resources Department.
With their blessing.
With their blessing. And the goal is, again, to get water from one place to another where it needs to go in any given year based on conditions. So that could mean getting water from fallowed acres in a senior irrigation district and delivering it to a junior irrigation district patron, such as somebody in North Unit Irrigation. The irrigation districts that we need to participate varies from year to year based, again, on the water. The people who can supply water might change depending on how much water is already in the system, already in the reservoir. But on top of that, you might be thinking, you're the Deschutes River Conservancy. What about the river? You can't just go farmer to farmer. That's something that we are very much considering, and we're trying to figure out right now. There's been several proposals floated, things promoting middle Deschutes flows in the summer that could build on top of the leasing program without dismantling leasing program, because again, we want that to stay as it is and grow even more. Or there's other options where we could be releasing water into the upper Deschutes in the winter out of Wickiup Reservoir and the year following a transaction from one farmer to another. Again, this is all very much in development, very new program, and we're lucky to have so many great partners that want to work with us to get this going. I will add that two things that we are really looking forward to, and it's helping push forward this process, is right now there are two different bills actually going through the Oregon legislature addressing water banking authority in Oregon. Oregon's one of the only Western states where water banking is not codified in statute. And so our hope is by getting some sort of authority codified in Oregon law, we'll be able to promote these programs even more. But on top of that, and I think more importantly, and this builds on all the work that DRC has done, is the collaborative effort to push this forward. Because this is such a new program, such a new concept, not just in Oregon, but also in the Deschutes, obviously, specifically, it requires all of our partners to be at the table and really helping us develop these programs. Like I said, there's so many parts of it, the industry component, the pathways for one transaction from one farmer to another that we haven't figured out entirely yet. But luckily for us, we have fantastic partners here in the basin. And I think that kind of leads into our next slide, right?
It does. I also just want to make one more note about market-based transactions. We've also been working with the cities for a very long time with our leasing program to help secure, and also with acquisitions to help secure water for cities and for growth. So that's another big part of what we do. We just left the mitigation piece off of the slide, but we're working to help secure their water. And again, hand in hand with all the partners, which leads us to Alex. Yes.
And before you can do your transfer, but before Alex comes up here, I also just want to acknowledge and appreciate Jen Hubert, who's one of our senior program managers at the DRC, and she has really been the driving force behind so many of the water transactions that we've been doing over the years. She runs the annual water leasing program, which Alex is plugging into and it will be helping administer and take over in time. But Jen's in the crowd too. She might be around to answer some questions later. But again, just from that, just to take a quick step back, the water transactions, we're talking about voluntary water transactions, people that have water rights that may not need to use all of that water right in a particular given year. And so whether it's the leasing program or the water bank, which is a concept that just basically sort of captures opportunity and process by which we can move water more efficiently and incentivize that stuff in the basin. So with that, let's talk about collaborative.
Yeah, I was just going to say, save all your hard questions on market-based transactions for Jen. We'll give her the microphone. All right, Alex is going to talk about another important tool in our toolkit, which is collaborative planning.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. I'm Alex Aarons. I'm a program manager at the Deschutes River Conservancy. I've been here since September, 5 months in almost. But I've been involved in collaborative basin planning for up to a couple of years now. Before I was at the DRC, I was sort of involved with this Deschutes Basin Water Collaborative that I'll be talking about in just a second. But as Jim and Lisa were saying earlier, the DRC was really founded on the principle of collaboration. We have all these diverse interests in water. There's a lot of different uses and users of water in the basin. And so naturally, any management action that affects one user can have implications for any other user on the system, because as we've sort of mentioned, we have a limited supply to help meet all these various needs that we have for water. And so it's really important to just to focus on getting all these people in the same room and just work on communicating with everybody. And when we look forward in our basin planning efforts, try to think about water management actions in the future that will sort of benefit everyone in some way, and at least have the sign off of everyone in this collaborative process. And I think, while it might be difficult to work with such a wide, diverse group of stakeholders that obviously come from different perspectives and different needs for water, I think the result of what we produce out of these basin planning efforts is much more durable. And we can really point to that and say, look at all these diverse stakeholders that agree with these decisions that we're making in the basin for water. And that goes a long way when we're pitching ideas to funders or to legislators and whoever may be interested. So that last slide just kind of showed a history, Yeah, you didn't. Oh, you didn't have to go back. That's all right. A history of collaboration in the basin, and it's taken various forms over the almost 30 years that the DRC has existed, from the Deschutes Water Alliance to the Deschutes Water Planning Initiative, Basin Study Work Group, and now the one that I'm going to talk about next is the Deschutes Basin Water Collaborative. And this is what I've been involved with over the past couple of years. This is a sort of collaborative group of these, I believe we're almost at 50 stakeholders representing a wide range of interests in water, from tribal partners, environmental advocates, irrigators, municipalities, counties, state and federal agencies, fly fishing groups, recreation, etc. Anyone that has an interest in water can come and become a member of the Deschutes Basin Water Collaborative. And what we've been working towards over the past few years is developing what's called a sort of a place-based plan for the Upper Deschutes Basin, following the state's, they have guidelines called the place-based planning guidelines that sort of highlight the uses of water, the needs for water, solutions that people have agreed upon to try to meet those needs, and then working towards actually agreeing on actual actions that people will implement on the ground going forward to help meet those needs. And that is the step that we are currently on right now in the process. It's chapter 5 out of 5. And we've already gone through chapter 2, which is just describing the basin, all the issues, etc. Chapter 3 is the needs. I don't need to go into all this detail, do I? Chapter 4 is just all the possible solutions that are out there that could help meet the needs. And then now we're into the real meat of it, the thick of it in chapter 5, which is what are we going to do? Who's going to do it? Where are we going to implement these things? On what timeline? Who's going to pay for it, etc. The real fun stuff. But kind of going back to sort of why we do this, it really just makes a stronger product when we put out a plan like this, when we eventually complete this plan and get it approved by the entire working group, that long list of names that you see up there, and then approved by the state agencies, then that really paints a strong picture of we're united. We agree that these are the tools that we should be using and how we should be using them to meet our needs. That really helps to bring in funding. If we have any recommendations for sort of policy changes that might be needed to enable other tools, that makes a stronger case to legislators. And also, just really importantly, it kind of keeps this sort of onus on continuing to communicate with each other, continuing to have everyone in the room together and collaborating, coordinating on solutions, and not just sort of being off in everyone's silo, doing things on their own. Because as they mentioned earlier, no work that we get done in the basin has been done alone. It's all with our partners. And so this effort really helps to sort of solidify all of that.
Thank you, Alex.
Thank you.
Yeah, I also just want to point out that this is a consensus-based process. So that means that we really are going for 100% consensus across 50 different entities.
Yeah.
So that is, I would say, a big part of why this isn't necessarily a process that's happened overnight to try to get 50 folks on board with every word that's in the plan and every action and that we're
coordinating
taking.
everyone's schedules and everything.
Yeah, all the things. So, but it is, we think it's a very worthy piece of the puzzle and an important tool in our toolkit. And now, in the interest of time, thank you, Alex. Appreciate you. I'm going to sort of speed through the next couple slides. Influencing policy, another tool in the toolkit. I will say that this is sort of a new arena for the Deschutes River Conservancy. We're sort of wading into this in hand with our collaborative partners at the collaborative and all of the other stakeholder groups. There have been a lot of conversations really about like what things need to be tweaked at the state level to enable us to more easily move water around to meet the needs, right? And so this is an area that we hope to grow into, helping to advocate for some policy changes that might be necessary to enable us all to meet all of the needs across the basin. But again, not something that the DRC is doing independently. We're working with all of our partners to come up with ideas that are going to be win-wins for multiple groups. So with that, where are we headed? And I'm going to be real quick. In the next 3 years, we are working to restore the flows in the upper Deschutes. Again, that's the stretch just below Wickiup Dam from 100 CFS to 300 CFS. This is work that's been going on for quite some time now, but we are all rowing in the same direction and hoping that within 3 to 4 years, not even hoping, in 3 to 4 years, we're going to restore flows to 300 CFS. We also are working to restore tributary flows in Trout Creek, Mackay Creek, which is a tributary of the Crooked River, and continuing to restore flows in Waichus Creek. And that is all because we have steelhead returning to the upper basin as a result of changes to the management and the design of the pilot or the Pelton Round Butte facility. We have anadromous fish in the upper basin now. And so we need habitat for those fish. And so this is an important part of the work that all of us partners are working on completing. So again, all this work gets done through modernizing irrigation systems, both the district systems and the on-farm systems, using a suite of voluntary market-based transactions to move water where it's needed. And then continuing to lead collaborative planning initiatives in the basin, and then influencing policy. So those are the tools. Those are all the different colors on the graph that you all saw earlier of what we're doing to make this work happen. And with that, we're going to turn it over to, well, unless you have some final words.
I just have one quick thing. I just want to thank you, Lisa, and thank all of the DRC staff for all the hard work that you guys do. I really appreciate not just the work that you do, but the fact that we come out here to the community and are available to folks to help answer questions. I think it's awesome. So I really appreciate everyone for that. And I appreciate all of the work that our partners do and all of the collaboration that we truly have with so many different folks. Central Oregon Irrigation District, all the different irrigation districts, all the different agency folks. This really is a tremendous level of effort from a tremendous web of people that are working in this basin. And it's really special and unique, and I want to underscore that. I've worked myself in the West for a long time, and the Deschutes really is a tremendous model for so many other watersheds and sort of challenges that face Western water issues. And the Deschutes has a tremendous group of people that are working on this. And I'm just really grateful for everybody's efforts on this front and all the success that we've seen. One last thank you. I also want to thank all of you for participating and for having an interest and wanting to get educated and wanting to do all the things that you can to try to contribute. So I'm done now, but we'll open it up for questions, and we've got our crew of DRC folks and other folks that are available to help answer them too. So.
And we have a microphone, so I'm going to ask, we do have an audience at home, so I'm going to ask those of you that do have questions in the audience to wait for Grant, I believe, is going to be coming by with a microphone to give you, so that the folks at home can hear your questions. So raise your hand if you have a question, and there's a couple right here, Grant. And Grant is making his way up, and Jen is moving up here in case anybody has really complicated transactions question.
As a recent refugee from South Florida, which has massive water problems, what are you doing about the urban development? Are you working with the cities on, keeping them supplied? And my major concern is the drop in the historical ground, the water level in the ground from which I live in Redmond, and they keep putting in new pumping plants.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Are you working to control that in any way?
Well, we can't stop growth. I don't think anyone told you not to come. So people are coming whether we like it or not. And but to answer your question, yes, we are working hand in hand with our municipalities. The City of Bend and others are COCO, which is the Central Oregon Cities Organization, is actively involved in the Deschutes Basin Water Collaborative effort. So we are in constant communication with the cities about their water needs and meeting their water needs. And the cities have done, I will say, a fantastic job with water conservation efforts. I mean, really, like the City of Bend has been recognized, I think, nationally, if not internationally, for all the efforts that they've put in to reduce water use in the for the city. So yes, we are working hand in hand with them. Jen works really closely with the cities to help to utilize leasing to help supply water for the cities in the summer months, which is when water demand is highest. For those of you that are new to Central Oregon, we do a great job conserving water in our homes, but then the summer happens and everyone turns on their sprinklers outside and waters their lawns, and the water usage in the cities goes whew. And that's also a time when water needs are highest for farmers, highest for rivers. So we are working with our cities. As far as groundwater declines, the state just passed a new set of rules, basically limiting pumping in specific areas, trying to stabilize groundwater levels. And that's the goal of the new rules. And so we are navigating those changes with our cities and trying to work with our partners to secure water for growth. So I know that might not be a fully satisfying answer, but yes, the cities are very much working with us hand in hand, and we're doing our best to make sure that all of the city's water needs can be met. And if you're curious more about groundwater, I would advocate that you watch December's seminar, which is recorded online, and it goes into detail about the state's new groundwater rules and how that is directly impacting the city. In fact, we had one of the panelists, we had the Oregon Water Resource Department had two panelists join us at the seminar, and then a representative, Mike Bittner from the city of Bend, was on that panel, and also Phil Chang from Deschutes County, and we talked a lot about city and urban water. So I would point you to that seminar. So
Well, thank you. I was the first person on my very long block to put in a dryscaping with gravel. So that's good news. Thank you.
yeah, thank you very much. And if you want to talk about Florida water issues later, I consider myself a Floregonian. So I went to grad school in Florida, and I could, yeah. Anyway, we should catch up over a beer.
So my question is sort of an economic one. So consider if I'm one of these carrot seed farmers up in Jefferson County. It's a high value crop, requires a lot of irrigation. And I look to the north of me in Gilliam, Wasco, Sherman County, see all these beautiful dryland farms growing wheat, no irrigation at all. If I say to myself, why can't I grow wheat here in Jefferson County, save all that irrigation water and lease it, put all that irrigation water into the river, where does the money come from to compensate me as a carrot seed farmer, to put that water or leave that water in the river? Is there some organization that pays these leasing costs?
That's a great question.
That is a really good question.
We do have support from different foundations and different grant programs that help provide funding for that. Um, we do have partnerships with different corporations that are trying to offset their water use that also provide funding that allows us that helps us support leasing. I could probably look to Jen and she'll have a few more things to point to specifically, but there are sources of funds out there that we utilize to help incentivize these sorts of transactions. I will also say that leasing as an opportunity isn't necessarily like wholesale right now. Like not just anybody can lease all the time whenever they want, because so many of the water rights are tied to irrigation districts. There's a certain level of management of systems, of the district systems, that sort of influence who can lease, when people can lease, and all that sort of thing. So it's not like we have an infinite supply of funds, nor do we have an infinite supply of opportunity for people to lease water that want to lease water right now. But what we're trying to do is both increase the funding that's available through the different sources that we have and through other creative ways, and then also help improve the irrigation networks for the districts to open up more opportunity for these sorts of leasing and transactions to happen.
So there's money available if I'm a environmentally conscious farmer and I see an opportunity to put water in the river rather than on a land. There's money available.
There is, but I think from what I understand, it's not going to completely offset potentially your loss for if there's a loss of going from carrot seed to wheat. And I don't know what the economics are behind that, but it's not like dollar for dollar we can come to your door and say like, don't worry, we got you covered. We'll make sure that you make exactly as much money as you did carrot seed farming. Unfortunately, we don't have that type of funding. So really what we have is funding that supports the program and helps to incentivize people leasing water. But it's definitely not like a buyout situation where we can go, farmer to farmer and say, stop, we'll reimburse you for every dollar that you made on that other crop to keep your water in the river. So does that help answer your question? Yeah. And again, I would point to Jen, who's sitting here in the front. Again, and this might be another opportunity for a beer, but to talk about exactly what the dollar figures look like for folks who lease their water in stream. And again, the leasing that Jim was alluding to, because we're dealing with 100-year-old infrastructure and ditches that are delivering water to people, not everybody necessarily can participate in the leasing program because that water may be needed not only to serve your farm, but also to serve a farm down the ditch from you. And if your water goes in the river, there might not be enough water in that ditch to serve your neighbor. So a lot of times the leasing opportunities are somewhat limited by our antiquated infrastructure. And that's part of the reason that piping is pretty important. So, okay, more questions.
Thank you. Living on the upper Deschutes, I'm interested in knowing when the reservoirs were built in time, and was it the Bureau of Reclamation that built them or another entity?
Good question. I'm looking at Kyle because he's going to correct me on this one, but I believe Wickiup Reservoir was constructed in the 40s. He's shaking his head, give or take. Yes, it was. So Wickiup Reservoir was constructed in the 40s, and the Bureau of Reclamation was involved in the construction of Wickiup. Crane Prairie, which is also a reservoir, was naturally a body of water prior to them building a dam, and I believe that one was built earlier. Built by private interests in 1922, and it's very wonderful to have a Kyle Gorman in the audience. Kyle Gorman was the regional director of this whole area for 30 years before retiring from the Oregon Water Resources Department. He's a wealth of knowledge of all things water, and I'm very grateful to him to be able to more adequately answer your question. So 1922, private interests for Crane Prairie. In the 40s, the Bureau helped with the construction of Wickiup.
And then what about Pelton Round Top?
Ooh, Pelton Round Butte. Pelton Round Butte was built in I'm going to think about this for a second, the 60s. 1964 is when it was completed, and it was relicensed in the early 2000s, which is why and how the water tower was built and anadromous fish were reintroduced to the upper basin. That was part of the relicensing of that facility.
Okay.
So.
And finally, is there any document that gives the chronology and the history of these facilities?
Ooh, of the facilities themselves.
The justification for it, what drove it, and that kind of thing. I mean, it was the heyday of the Bureau of Reclamation, of course.
Mm-hmm. The PGE website has the Portland General Electric website has quite a bit of information. And yeah, I will say that, for instance, the Upper Deschutes, the Crane Prairie Reservoir, and Wickiup Reservoir, those reservoirs were built exclusively for the use of irrigation. I mean, that's their primary purpose. When it comes to the Pelton Round Butte facility, that facility generates power.
Right.
So so it's very astute. There are a lot of dams out there, and they all have different purposes, right? And so in our area, irrigation and power. If you go over to the Western Cascades, lots of dams for flood control. So which is a little different, again, with the runoff issue based on a different geology west of the Cascades. So
Thanks very much.
yeah.
Do you have a question? Yeah. Go ahead.
Yep. We're getting to hear from Jen Hubert, our senior program manager.
Okay. Is this on? Okay. So I was going to say also on the Bureau of Reclamation website, the Deschutes project page that gives a lot of history as well.
Thank you, Jen.
Hey, I think the last slide before this noted that you guys have a goal to improve CFS from 100 to 400 or something. How do you how do you intend to do that?
It's a good question. So one thing we haven't talked about, and I don't want to get too in the weeds about it, but there is an endangered species listed in our basin, the spotted frog. And with that endangered species, we have a habitat conservation plan that all of the irrigation districts and the city of Prineville worked hand in hand with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife and the National Marine Fisheries Service to put together a plan for the spotted frog, so that the irrigation districts could have a permit to continue to operate. And as part of that plan, they stipulated that they were going to increase flows to 300 CFS and then eventually to 400 to 500 CFS. So essentially restoring the upper Deschutes River. And we are doing that through all the tools that we have talked about in this presentation. So right now we're really leaning super heavily on the irrigation district piping that's happening, which is saving huge chunks of water. I mean, we had plans to pipe a couple of miles next year, and that's going to save, I'm trying to think, 12 CFS just with a couple of miles. We completed, let's see, 7.9 miles of piping a few years ago, and that saved 30 plus CFS. So every time we get one of those piping projects in the ground, we're able to permanently restore flows in the upper Deschutes River. And the way that we're doing that, which is kind of complicated, is that the irrigation district that is relying on those flows to irrigate is the North Unit Irrigation District up in that Culver Madras area. They're relying on that water that's stored in Wickiup. So essentially what we're doing is we're piping the irrigation districts that have more secure water rights earlier, like senior water rights, saving that water, and that water gets passed to North Unit Irrigation District for them to use to grow crops in the summer months. And then in return for that, they're able to release more water from the dam in the winter months to restore the upper Deschutes. So again, it's like everybody working together to make it happen, working on projects in senior districts, passing water to junior districts releasing water from the dam to restore the river.
First of all, heck yeah. Thank you for everything that you're doing. Amazing stuff. But just with the piping project, and I'm sure you're conscious of it, so I'm just curious how you're tracking and managing when you do pipe, the impact on the groundwater from whatever it's seeping into, and kind of how you're watching that and managing that.
That is an excellent question. We are working hand in hand with the Oregon Water Resources Department as we speak, attempting to quantify what that looks like for the groundwater resources in light of the new rules that have come out just late last year about groundwater and wanting to keep groundwater levels stable. So right now, the Oregon Water Resources Department is essentially trying to do a study, or they are doing a study, they're not trying to, they're doing a study to try to quantify what groundwater levels looked like before we dug any of the canals. Like what was the natural state of the groundwater before we all got here and started digging canals and moving water across the landscape. And they plan to use that to sort of determine what the relatively stable groundwater level is from which to start thinking about where and how they can issue permits. So yes, piping canals is impacting the groundwater, but it also is having those open canals has greatly impacted the river for the last 100 years. So it's a little bit of a trade-off, right? Yeah, exactly. And so I think what we could say, and what the Water Resources Department say, is like those canals have artificially been supplementing groundwater. And so we're trying to figure out what that looks like so that we can take it into consideration for planning. So.
And some of the groundwater declines that we are seeing presently, it's not just whether things are piped or not. I mean, there's climate change and there's different factors. There's growth just across, the basin in general. So there's a lot of factors that are influencing groundwater decline.
I thought we might get a question about this, so I threw a slide together to hopefully be able to answer it. So we need to update the study. I want to just caveat this: that this study was done almost 10 years ago, I think. So a lot of canal piping has happened since then. So I don't think that we can wholeheartedly rely on the numbers in this chart. But essentially, climate represents, according to the most recent study, what is that? What is it? 65% of declines in groundwater are climate based. And then pumping and use of groundwater 25%, and canal lining was 10%. So, but again, caveated with the fact that a lot more piping has occurred. And so this picture looks different. But to Jim's point, climate is the major driver of groundwater declines in the area. And piping is not without its impacts. But yes, again, artificially, it has been impacting groundwater levels for the last 100 years. So.
Okay, thank you. Firstly, thanks so much for the seminar. This was so interesting. I've been in Bend about 15 years and had so many questions about the Deschutes, and they've almost all been answered tonight. So thanks to all of you. I just had a question. You showed a chart that showed, it was a pie chart of allocations, and I think it was 86% to ag and 12% to stream and 2% to municipality. I'm just curious where the tribal water rights fit in, and also just in sort of the pecking order you showed in terms of the most senior water rights for the different irrigation districts, where tribal rights fit into that as well.
That is such an excellent question that I'm not sure I'm going to adequately be able to answer. But here, I'm gonna give you my best guess, and then what I would love to do is follow up with you after the seminar when I can really adequately dive into that. But I believe that pie chart with 86 and 12 and 2% represents the surface water rights in the upper Deschutes Basin. And my understanding is that the tribe's water rights are in the lower basin. So the short answer is they're not on that chart, because I don't believe the tribes technically have any water rights in the upper basin. That being said, the lower basin is highly dependent on what happens in the upper basin, so it's all tied together. And of course, the tribes have rights, customary rights to hunt and fish all over their ceded lands, which means the upper basin as well. And so they are very invested in seeing the rivers restored and the fisheries healthy, and habitat for all the creatures that they hold dear. So so I would say they're not officially in that chart, but that 12% helps a little bit to with their interests, essentially. Yeah. Oh, Kyle's gonna chime in. I feel like we need to give him a microphone though. We got one right in front of him. Perfect. Kyle's gonna help.
One thing that I wanted to emphasize is that in the settlement agreement with the tribes from 1997, their rights are described as the oldest water rights in the basin, and in other places in the state, tribal in-stream water rights and other water rights are described as time immemorial. So their rights are time immemorial. They're the oldest in the basin. They include in-stream flows on the Metolius River and the Deschutes River from the Pelton Round Butte Dam downstream. So they do have senior water rights.
But I wasn't totally wrong, because that was
Not at all.
below the below the dam, lower river. Okay. Thank
Thank
you,
you, Kyle.
Kyle. Appreciate you. Okay, here we go. We got a new one.
Thanks for being here, to echo everyone else. But so does the DRC and your partners, do you do any work with beaver dam analogs for watershed restoration at all? I know it's becoming more popular, so.
Yes. Yes, we have not, again, because we don't do the actual in the stream restoration work. We don't do beaver dam analogs, but our partners definitely use beaver dam analogs, and my coworkers have gone out and built beaver dam analogs. I'm kind of jealous, because I've been in meetings with
Yeah, it's
50
pretty cool.
stakeholders.
So to name a couple of groups, I know the Crooked River Watershed Council and the Crook County Soil and Water Conservation District have been working a lot in their watershed on beaver dam analogs. Like Lisa said, myself and Jacob and some of us have actually been out on the ground helping build these things. From our standpoint, just sort of our focus and our mission is more focused on the flow aspect itself. So we don't tend to dive as much into the habitat, but we do work with our partners, whether it's the Crooked River Watershed Council or the Upper Deschutes Watershed Council, to kind of help support them, and sometimes even collectively, like we'll put in on grants together to help bring the funding in, but then it would be those partners that are doing a lot of the actual on the ground work, and we're just kind of giving the cheerleader, kind of rah in the background.
Well, and I'm going to piggyback on that and just cheerlead beavers in general as the state animal, because going back to the history of this area, they were incredibly important ecosystem engineers. If you think back to the whole needing to have wood in the streams and the, braided channels and the floodplains, like that was all because of beaver. And so it wasn't just the logging industry and the straightening of the channels that caused, a lot of the changes in our hydrology in the West. It was also like extirpating beavers from systems. I mean, hunting beavers for pelts was also part of that whole limitless resources. Let's put the resources to work. And so so beavers are incredibly important. And now we know what we didn't know that back then, and we're working to try to emulate them.
And I will add too, for those of you that don't know, so beaver dam analog is really just sort of a simple but handmade dam that holds water back, that helps the water back up and flow back and attach to the floodplain, which creates basically kind of short reach water retention that helps then kind of regulate flows over the season. So that from a flow restoration standpoint, it actually is a really important tool, whether it's high meadow restoration or these beaver dam analogs that can help retain water in the system, have that infiltrate back into these watersheds, and then it shows up as part of the groundwater and cooler water later in the season. So it's really great and important, and it's a part of the flow restoration toolbox, but not something that we focus on exclusively.
So many funny things I could say about beavers, but let's move on. Any other questions in the audience? We haven't had any questions from the home audience. Everybody's been so quiet. All right. Well, going once, going twice. I will say, oh, wait, got one more. Okay.
We're back.
We're back.
Sorry, it's just a short one, I think. But it was so interesting to hear a little bit about the collaborative basin planning process, and amazing to learn that you're aiming for 100% agreement with so many competing interests. I was just curious, it sounds like it's a really long time developing the plan. How long is the plan good for? What's the timeline?
Question.
Should figure that out.
Yeah. Do we really have that laid out?
I
don't
think
we
what
do.
we're aiming for is a draft plan, a plan that we can run with, but knowing that it's going to be iterative and that we're going to have to make changes to it. I mean, we're going to do our absolute best to come up with an implementation plan that everybody agrees to. But I mean, everything is constantly changing. I mean, right now, given everything that's going on at the federal level and so much of our funding for a lot of these projects being federal, everything is changing hour by hour. So we totally acknowledge that we're not going to have a plan that we can rubber stamp and say we're good for the next 30 years. We'll talk about it again 30 years from now, but more that we're going to have to continue to have conversations and to have open dialogue and keep working together as the landscape shifts.
Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead, Alex. Oh, it's intended to be a living document, which is why we haven't put sort of a time frame on it. And I think even when the plan's been approved and put out there and gotten state recognition, we're still going to convene with the stakeholders. We're still going to do outreach to the groups that have to implement these actions. We're going to continue to sort of work to, ideas change and potential opportunities become available, we can, put those into future iterations of the plan as well.
And I'd just add too that, we're thinking about it in terms of short term, midterm, long term too. So there are definitely, more descriptive actions that we will, bring forward and would intend to implement over the next 5 years, and then other maybe projects in concept for the midterm, and then just sort of broader brush, like here's where we're trying to go, here's the tools that we think we're going to rely on over time. And yes, to Alex's point, there's so much that changes year to year to year. You know, we want to have flexibility in there too, but we also want to have specificity so that we know what we should be focusing on over the next, 5-year time horizon or whatever, and we know what we're trying to build on top of and toward, for the years beyond that.
And that helps getting to that 100% agreement as well, because there might be some concepts that we're just not fully ready yet to grasp, but we can put them in the long term. We can say aspirationally, we may want to consider this in the future, and then that kind of leaves the opportunity open for us to continue to have those conversations.
Okay, we do have an online question that is very poignant. How is federal funding uncertainty affecting your work, and how can we as a community help? Yeah, fantastic. Federal funding uncertainty is certainly affecting our work. With the irrigation modernization program, I was hoping and planning on putting about $7 million worth of projects in the ground between now and summer. And quite honestly, I don't know if we're going to put a single project in the ground between now and summer. So that's a lot of projects and a lot of saved water and a lot of construction jobs and materials and things that were going to be spent in our local community. And that is literally changing hour by hour, day by day. I've been on the phone with all of our partners, federal partners and state partners, constantly for the last couple of weeks. So we're all learning to pivot and doing the best with what we have. And as far as what you all can do to help, there's a couple things I can think of. One is you all can contribute to the Deschutes River Conservancy and our work. We have a new way to contribute, which is to join our in-stream collective. Essentially, what this means is that there are various levels of donations, but for a monthly donation as low as $12, you can help offset your personal water usage in your home and contribute to the work that we and our partners do. Also, I would say that you all can call senators, representatives, et cetera, encourage other folks who live in other states with different senators and representatives to call them as well, and really try to ask for the federal government to at least make good on the agreements that they have made with folks. Because one thing I will point out for people who aren't really familiar with how federal funding works is that whether you're a farmer who has a contract with the federal government to put in a sprinkler system, or whether you're a nonprofit or another entity that has a contract with the federal government, you get reimbursements. So you have to put that money out, and then you have to ask for that money to be reimbursed. And so there are a lot of people right now who are left holding the bag financially on things that they have paid for that they're not sure they're going to be reimbursed for. And then there's a lot of fear around the scarcity of folks not wanting to write big checks, like for a $5 million piping project, not knowing if that funding money, sorry, that money is going to be there when the reimbursement time comes. So that is what I think that the main things that you all can do to help right now, unless anybody can you think of anything else?
No, I think that's good. I just to let people know. So, the Deschutes River Conservancy, we've got funding sources from lots of different kind of pots and pools, and some of it is from donations from people like you. Some of it is from the federal grants that we manage. Some of it is state grants that we manage. Some of it is other private foundations. Right now, our operating for this year is about 40% dependent on federal grants. And so just the way that things are happening with the administration right now, it doesn't mean that that money is necessarily going away. But as Lisa pointed out, because there's a pause in some of that funding, it does kind of create a level of uncertainty for us and just a little bit of anxiety, right? Like we're trying to figure out how are we going to get these projects on the ground given the timeframes that we have to work with things. We work a lot with the irrigation districts, and that also means that the districts need to have their water flowing in the spring when, when the farms start and the ranches start. So we have, plans to try to do certain projects before that irrigation window happens. And now with the certain level of uncertainty, even if it comes back later on, some of these projects may get sort of bumped, which when you are mixing a variety of pots of funding can kind of it's like a series of dominoes, right? Like, well, this funding is only available until this point in time, but this just got paused. Doesn't just mean we can then, oh, well, we just wait 6 months to do the project, because the other piece of the funding might now also be at risk because that one's going. So it's very complicated. And I appreciate the question for sure. And yeah, so we can always use support from all the different ways that we can get it. And so the In-Stream Collective is one way that just sort of folks from the community can contribute. Larger donations are always nice as well. Those sorts of funds are also really important for us because they're effectively unrestricted, what's called unrestricted funding, which means we can put it towards lots of things in flexible ways. When we have a grant, like a federal grant or state grant, and rightly so, but they're very prescriptive. This is the funds that you have, but it's for these things, right? And so what's really great about the funds that we can get through something like the In-Stream Collective or some of the private donations that we get is we really have so much more flexibility, and that gives us the room to navigate these sorts of changes to whether it's administration or grant programs or whatever. So yeah, I think that covers it.
I'm also going to just take this opportunity, since you've met a lot of the DRC team tonight throughout this program, I want to introduce Ben in the background. Wave your hand, Ben. Ben is the guy that you probably want to talk to if you would want to join the In-Stream Collective, because he is the brains behind that, or one of the brains, I should say, behind that program.
Newly minted development manager.
Yes, newly minted development manager at the Deschutes River Conservancy. So, without any further questions, I think we're going to wrap up. But before we do, I just want to thank you all so much for coming and for listening and for learning and for caring. And I also want to put out a plug that we will do another one of these. We don't have it on the books yet, but it is going to happen in April. And the topic is to be determined. I think we're vacillating between, should we talk about really exciting stuff that's happening with fish? Or depending on what's going on at the legislative level at the state, should we talk about really exciting stuff that's happening with water banking? So stay tuned, and we'll let you know. We got to vote for fish in the audience. Okay, and we will stick around if you all want to talk about Florida water issues or leasing programs or have any other questions. We'll stick around. I might need to have a beer in my hand for that part, though. So, all right, thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Oh, one more thing. The Tower Theater. We are having a fly fishing event, a film at the Tower Theater on April 10th. So please, everybody, come to that as well.
Should be really cool. Thank you, everyone.
It sells out.